What if I told you that Hollywood's golden star Blake Lively is facing the most explosive courtroom backlash of her career, and this time it isn't just whispers behind the scenes or petty gossip columns, but an all-out war in federal court, where every filing feels like a dagger and every headline feels like a countdown to disaster Wayfair. And their attorneys have finally unleashed a fiery response that not only tears apart Blake's claims, but also threatens to expose the darker truth about manipulation media games and a relentless campaign that could turn the entire industry upside down. Stay with me because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about fame, power, and survival in Hollywood. Imagine a courtroom not as a sterile chamber of law and order, but as a battlefield dripping with the tension of whispered alliances, broken promises, and reputations on the brink of annihilation, where every filing is more than a document. It is a weapon sharpened to cut down the opposing side, and the silence between hearings feels louder than the gavel itself. This is where Blake Lively finds herself a woman once adored on the red carpet, now tangled in accusations, counterclaims, and explosive rhetoric that has transformed what was supposed to be a legal dispute into a Hollywood saga larger than any film she has ever starred in. Wayfair, and its attorneys have finally fired back with a venomous response to her motion for sanctions. And if you thought this was just another routine courtroom skirmish, you are mistaken, because the words inked onto those pages are not just legal arguments. They are a mirror reflecting every shadow, every contradiction, and every strategic misstep that Blake and her team have unleashed into the world. What makes this moment so haunting is the sense that the mask of celebrity perfection is cracking before our eyes, revealing something raw, manipulative, and ruthless beneath the glamour. Wayfair's lawyers accuse her of orchestrating a relentless campaign to smear Brian Friedman, their lead counsel, a campaign they argue was not just about protecting her reputation, but about weaponizing it, turning the sympathy of the public into a shield while using the language of survivors and victimhood to silence scrutiny. And this is where the story twists, because the very words that once empowered women to be believed without hesitation are now painted as tools in a game of power, manipulation, and control. The filings reveal that Blake pointed to statements Friedman made about her credibility, her deposition, her status as a Hollywood elite, and claimed those words were prejudicial, dangerous enough to poison a potential jury pool. But Wayfair's team strikes back with cold precision. They argue that not only are his words protected under the rules, but that Blake herself has launched a far more aggressive and coordinated media campaign, one that included leaking her draft complaint to the New York Times before it was ever filed, one that leaned on emotional survivor language to frame Justin Baldoni as a predator without ever filing criminal charges or raising HR complaints, one that strategically dragged Taylor Swift's name into the mud by weaving her into scenario planning and subpoenas designed to inflame Swift's millions of fans against the defendants. The chilling irony, Wayfair notes, is that Blake has ignored her own conduct in creating the very media circus she now condemns. And in doing so, she may have unleashed a backlash more devastating than any allegation made against her. The filings detail how she alienated Baldoni during production, encouraged cast and crew to unfollow him, froze him out of the marketing campaign, and even allegedly banished him and his family to the basement during the premiere of the film, a public act of humiliation, long before Friedman ever joined the battlefield. And yet she insists he is the architect of her pain. The spine Wayfair has finally grown emerges on page 5 of their response, where they go directly for the jugular, writing that Blake Lively conveniently ignores her own counsel's very public campaign to savage defendants and their counsel in the press. The words leap off the page because for months audiences have wondered why her lawyers were allowed to unleash barrage after barrage of fiery accusations painting Baldoni as a liar, an abuser, a fraud, while every minor rebuttal from Friedman was met with threats of sanctions and judicial scolding. It feels like watching a chess match where one player is permitted to hurl the pieces across the board while the other must politely bow and wait for permission to move. And in that imbalance, the seeds of outrage have been growing quietly among observers who feel the scales of justice bending under the weight of celebrity. But Wayfair's lawyers have flipped the narrative, reframing the alleged smear campaign not as their doing, but as the relentless war Blake herself has waged since the film's release. They describe her latest sanctions motion as just another salvo in her ongoing crusade, calculated not only to intimidate counsel, but to choke Friedman's ability to defend his clients. The language is surgical, precise, and yet dripping with disdain. painting her as a celebrity so blinded by her own narrative that she cannot see how her actions have set fire to the very stage she is standing on. And perhaps the most dangerous detail buried within the filing is the subtle warning that the judge has already ordered all parties to refrain from disrespectful language and personal attacks in court. Documents an order that carries the weight of contempt of court if violated. The implication is chilling if Blake and her team continue to lace their filings with venomous swipes at opposing counsel. They may soon find themselves the very targets of sanctions, the very punishment they have sought to impose on others. The trap she set for Friedman may now be snapping shut around her ankles. And as this war escalates, the stakes are no longer just about reputations or headlines, but about whether Blake Lively will walk out of this courtroom with her star power intact, or whether she will become a cautionary tale of what happens when Hollywood bravado collides with the cold, hard rules of law. And this is only the beginning, because the further you dig into this filing, the more it unravels into a story of hypocrisy, double standards, and a legal system caught between protecting free speech and curbing the theater of celebrity warfare. And the deeper you look, the more shocking the revelations become. The fallout only deepened as the story that had started as whispers behind closed doors now erupted into a spectacle that nobody in Hollywood could ignore, and the very fabric of celebrity alliances was being tested in ways not seen in years, because this wasn't just about Blake Lively anymore. This was about power, influence, loyalty, and the fragile illusion that Hollywood stars had built around themselves for decades. And as the media frenzy intensified, the weight of public opinion became almost unbearable, because for the first time in a long time, Blake wasn't in control of her narrative, and the spotlight that once adored her, every move now burned like a magnifying glass exposing cracks that she had worked so hard to keep hidden. And people everywhere couldn't stop talking about the arrogance with which she had tried to silence her critics and bury her rivals, and yet here she was trapped in the very web she had spun herself, because the documents, the leaks, the testimonies, they were all stacking against her, and no matter how polished her PR machine once looked, the damage control now seemed amateurish, desperate, even pathetic in the eyes of those who had once praised her. And as the weeks dragged on, you could almost sense the shifting tone in every magazine article, every late-night joke, every trending hashtag, because the tide had turned, and when Hollywood smells blood, it circles like sharks ready to devour anyone who shows weakness. And Blake's weakness was now on full display, and it wasn't just her enemies who were talking, it was her friends, her peers, even those she thought were bound to her in unshakable loyalty, because the truth about Hollywood is that loyalty lasts only as long as you're useful. And the moment you become a liability, the same people who once toasted you at premieres and laughed with you on red carpets will act like they barely knew your name. And that was exactly what was happening as her so-called inner circle started to fracture, because who wanted to go down with her when she was already sinking? And then came the most shocking shift of all, when fans themselves turned cold. Because for years, the image of Blake Lively had been carefully curated, a blend of elegance, charm, and relatability that made her seem untouchable. But now those same fans were poring over every court document, every leak, every rumor, and seeing her in a new light, not as a victim, not as a misunderstood star, but as a calculating figure who thought she could manipulate everyone around her. And when fans feel betrayed, the anger is far worse than indifference, because betrayal creates outrage, and outrage spreads like wildfire in the digital age. And so comment sections that once overflowed with heart emojis and kind words now brimmed with scathing critiques, mocking memes, and declarations that they would never see her the same way again, and each late-night host piling on with a joke, each viral TikTok skewering her. Legal arguments, each YouTube commentator breaking down the inconsistencies in her story, added layers to the avalanche that was burying her. And as for her allies in Hollywood, they now had a dilemma. Do they risk defending her and get dragged into the mess? Or do they slowly distance themselves, pretending they were never really that close to begin with? And it's no coincidence that whispers started surfacing about old grudges, about those she had undercut for roles, about colleagues who found her dismissive or manipulative, because scandals like this never stay contained. They dredge up everything from the past, and suddenly a decade's worth of whispered complaints find their way into the headlines. And it wasn't long before the public narrative shifted from Blake is in trouble to was Blake always like this? And that shift is deadly, because once the public decides your entire career was built on a lie, every smile, every speech, every interview becomes evidence, in their eyes, of duplicity. And the thing about Hollywood is that perception becomes reality faster than truth itself. And so the perception of Blake as a backstabber, a manipulator, a desperate figure clawing to hold on to her relevance, took root and began to harden into the public consciousness. And even those who might have privately sympathized with her no longer dared to say so because the backlash was too strong and nobody wants to be the last defender of a sinking ship. And meanwhile, the legal side of this disaster dragged on with new filings, new hearings, and new revelations that seemed to appear like clockwork, and each one chipped away at her credibility, because every time she tried to spin the story in her favor, reality struck back harder than before. And pundits on cable news began analyzing the case not as a celebrity squabble, but as a study in arrogance and downfall, a warning of what happens when someone thinks they're too big to be held accountable. And it wasn't just entertainment outlets anymore. Even mainstream political commentators and cultural critics weighed in because the scandal had transcended gossip and become a national conversation about accountability, about fame, about how quickly power can evaporate when the truth starts clawing its way to the surface. And with each passing day, it became clear that no matter what happened in the courtroom, Blake had already lost the court of public opinion because the memes, the headlines, the late-night jokes, they would outlive any verdict, and her once pristine brand was tarnished forever. And then came the whispers about Ryan Reynolds, her husband, the one person she thought she could always rely on, because when scandals reach this level, they never stay confined to just one person. And suddenly the questions weren't just about her, but about what he knew, what he tolerated, what role, if any, he played in the strategies she employed, and that dragged him into the firestorm as well, and you could see it in his body language, in the way he avoided questions on red carpets. In the silence that grew louder each day, he refused to comment because Hollywood couples thrive on their image as a unit. But when one half collapses, the other is dragged into the abyss, whether they like it or not. And the more this dragged on, the more it became a Hollywood parable, a cautionary tale unfolding in real time. And everyone from aspiring actors to seasoned veterans watched with a mix of horror and fascination because they all know deep down it could be them one day if they ever misstep. And in that sense, Blake's collapse wasn't just her own tragedy. It was a mirror held up to an industry built on fragile facades and ruthless competition. And that's why the reaction has been so visceral, because people aren't just watching Blake fall, they're watching the myth of Hollywood perfection crumble. And for every star who ever stepped on a rival to climb higher, for every executive who silenced a critic with power and money, for every carefully crafted image that hides the messy reality underneath Blake's scandal, is a reminder that the truth has a way of erupting sooner or later, and when it does, it spares no one. And that is why this story isn't just another headline. It is a cultural reckoning. And Blake Lively, whether she wanted to or not, has become the face of that reckoning. And no matter how many interviews she does in the future, no matter how many comebacks she attempts, the shadow of this scandal will follow her because Hollywood forgets, but the internet never does. And every misstep is archived, every headline saved, every meme immortalized. And that is the prison she now finds herself in, a prison not of bars but of perception. And once that prison closes in, there is almost no escape. In the end, what this saga truly reveals is not just the downfall of one star or the unraveling of a carefully crafted Hollywood illusion, but the way power itself collapses when truth becomes undeniable for months, whispers turned into headlines, speculation turned into depositions, and private messages became public weapons. What was once dismissed as gossip transformed into evidence, and every player who thought they could outmaneuver exposure now finds themselves cornered. The court of law and the court of public opinion have merged into one relentless arena, and no amount of spin, PR, or desperate reinvention can undo the damage that has been done. Careers, reputations, friendships, and even families have been scorched by the wildfire of scandal. And in this inferno, there are no true winners, because even those who walk away technically vindicated remain scarred by what they endured. Yet there is a clarity in the wreckage, a reminder that Hollywood's golden facade is brittle, and that every secret eventually surfaces no matter how fiercely it is buried. This story has become more than just a headline. It has become a mirror, forcing everyone watching, from fans to insiders, to confront the hypocrisy of a system built on silence and pretense. The spectacle may fade, the headlines may shift, but the consequences will echo for years, because once masks are torn off, they cannot be put back on. Once trust is shattered, it cannot be rebuilt. And once the truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. And so as the dust settles, the real question is not who survived the storm, but what will remain when the illusions have burned away.